And I came across this guy named Benny Lewis, actually. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
I met Benny in Mexico, actually.
That's cool. I sent him a message and an email, and he hasn't gotten back to me, so maybe you can set me up.
Hola amigos, buenos días, buenas tardes o buenas noches. Aquí estoy con Michael Harper, Spanish, la leyenda. Michael, thanks so much for being with me today.
Of course, man. Thanks for having me.
I saw Michael on Instagram, and I thought to myself, gosh, I love this guy's content. He speaks good Spanish, he's got really nice content. So I reached out. Here we are, and we're going to talk a little bit about you, how you learned Spanish, your journey and everything.
Grew up in the United States in a pretty small town. I live in Georgia, probably lived here for a long time, and just decided to learn Spanish a few years ago. Didn't know any Spanish at all before. My parents didn't speak Spanish and nothing like that, and just fell in love with the culture, fell in love with the language, and it led me to like crazy things. Led me to my wife, obviously. It led what I do now as a career. And all of my friends and family are just Spanish speakers now, and I get to travel. Like, I just got back from Argentina, like we were talking about before, and just been awesome.
You said you're 24 now, right?
24, yeah, about to turn 25.
What age did you start learning?
I think I was like 18 or 19, the last semester of high school or something like that.
So that was like maybe 5 years ago or so?
Yeah, probably about 5 years ago now.
Everyone always wants to know, how do I learn language fluently? How do I have conversations with people? What do I do? Tell us a little bit about what the process was like for you specifically.
It's weird because when I decided to learn Spanish, it all started in France, which is weird. We had this like foreign exchange trip where I would go to France and stay with this guy for a couple weeks. And we were in like high school Spanish classes, where you don't really learn anything. And so while we were there, we had two tour guides, and one of them was from Spain there and didn't speak English, just spoke French. And so we were like, whatever, let's go we felt bad because it was kind of awkward. So we started to talk to her in like our horrible Spanish, saying just literally like, I like to dance, as far as the conversation went. And it was like so cool because even though our Spanish sucked so bad, she thought it was the coolest thing that we were talking in her language with her. And that kind of got me hooked because I also had, like, I played soccer all throughout high school all my life, and half the people on the team spoke Spanish. So I got home and I was like, it would be the coolest thing if I could speak to other people in their language, because especially when you're an American, the reaction that you get from a native Spanish speaker when you speak their language is like second to none. It's really cool. So that feeling got me hooked. So I was like, how do I learn this thing? I'm really impatient, like it's just my personality. So I literally looked up on YouTube like how to learn a language faster in whatever amount of time. And I came across this guy named Benny Lewis, actually. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
I met Benny in Mexico, actually.
That's cool. I sent him a message and an email, and he hasn't gotten back to me, so maybe you can set me up. I just saw like his TED Talk. It's like a 20-minute TED Talk about how to become fluent in like 3 months or whatever. And all I needed was to know that it was possible. I was like, now that I know it can be done, how do I do it? I want to do it my way because classes is not teaching me anything. I just went to work. I figured, okay, how do I communicate with people? Because at the end of the day, language is, you're supposed to just be able to communicate with people, right? So I figured the hardest part in Spanish are the verbs. Like, verbs change so much. I can't have a sentence without a verb. So I'm just going to figure out how to talk in every tense possible. So whereas most classes will take years and years to teach you all the verb tenses, present, and then maybe the past, and then even then, like, you don't really use the language. I was like, I'm going to try to just focus all on the verbs and just talk to people. And so I just figured out I need to talk with people. I would book these private lessons and online, and then I would just get on apps like Hello Talk and Tandem and all this other, or whatever that was out there. I would just find ways to talk to native speakers. I had my best buddy at the time was he spoke Spanish at home, so I was like, hey, I'm learning Spanish, and we just started to text each other in Spanish every time. Just things like that, just using the language, forcing myself to think in Spanish as much as possible. And within a few months, I was what I consider pretty fluent, where to me, fluency is like, it's not about how you can pass an exam or not.
Sure.
To me, being fluent means that you can communicate easily in Spanish and you can understand most of what people are saying to you. Like when you can say whatever you want, or at least figure out a way to get your point across without having to like stress too much or translate a lot in your head, and you can understand other people, that to me is pretty fluent. That's kind of a quick summary of my journey and what I focused on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like a big lesson I've learned from a lot of people like yourself is, and I suppose myself as well, is the idea that learning the language almost becomes kind of part of your identity and just a part of your everyday life. And I think a lot of times students lack that, and so their learning progress is much slower. Or like you said, right, for you, going to high school Spanish class or this more structured form of learning wasn't working for you, and so you said, what's going to work for me? Which I think a lot of times students hear like, oh, well, this person said this person said this, and they're like, what do? I don't know what to do. It's kind of like at the end of the day, you know what? All these different methods and everything work, but it's like what works best for you.
What a lot of people lack, and the reason people take forever, is they don't treat it like a language, they treat it like an exam they have to study for. Whenever I get messages from like students or whatever going, how much should I study a day, or what do I need to do every single day, like what do I do today and tomorrow and the next day, it's like you're going to struggle the most likely because you're not treating it like a language. You need to use it, you need to make it a part of your life, and like you said, it becomes your identity almost. It's really an uncomfortable thing for your brain to like think in a different language. It's really uncomfortable, and it's like your brain goes into survival mode. It's like, don't do that, this is frustrating, stop it, put it down. And if you can just force your brain into thinking and operating in another language, like putting your phone in Spanish is a big thing, not just for vocabulary, but it's like it forces your brain to go, either you figure this thing out or we're gonna have a really tough time.
Right.
And once your brain makes that switch, you start to notice yourself thinking in Spanish. You don't have to translate as much anymore, and in the back of your mind, it's like everything you do and say, you're trying to figure out how to live your life and say those things in Spanish as well. And once you get to that point, from there it just gets so much easier.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, imagining like you grew up in a Spanish-speaking country, so it's like, okay, I'm gonna listen to music in Spanish, watch stuff in Spanish, because by doing this and forcing your brain to kind of think in the language, like you said, it's uncomfortable, but that's when you're, oh gosh, I keep hearing this, or okay, what is this? I keep hearing this, okay, what is that? Oh, it's this, or it's slowly but surely.
Like, it's not supposed to be easy. Nothing like worth doing is ever gonna be like super easy or not comfortable.
Totally.
Like, if you wanna get big muscles or lose weight, it's like, it's not fun, and it takes a little bit of time, but once you just force yourself into going, this is what we're doing. There was this I saw this interview with this guy the other day who had a similar, idea of learning a language within a matter of months, and he gave this example I'll probably butcher, but I'll try to give it anyway. So learning to type on like a Chinese keyboard is supposedly really difficult, and people can take months and years getting the hang of it. But he said this one person had this assignment they had to do where they had to write this thing in Chinese by, like, I don't know, 8 o'clock in the morning. It's like, I guarantee you that person learned how to do it by that morning. It's because it's like you were forced to use it. It's not that you were just sitting there studying something. It's you had to formulate it, you had to figure it out. That's why I tell people that you have to speak Spanish. Like, you can be a great reader, a writer, a listener, but your brain works differently when you have to produce words and speak them out loud and think of them yourself rather than when you just read it and listen to it.
Totally. It's so funny how a lot of times students say, I'm not learning, I'm not improving, but then you talk to them and you realize they're not really speaking.
Every time someone joins my program, I make them film a before video. I'm like, I want you to speak in Spanish, because then a couple months down the road, when you don't feel a lot of progress, you look back at that video and you're like, okay, I've come a little bit.
Yeah, totally. Interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I also like what you said about the deadline, right? The idea of like, okay, it's got to get done at this point. And I think that's why a lot of times, especially for self-learners, they struggle with the accountability, which is why having a teacher is really good to say, you got to get this done by X date, or you need to do this, because all of a sudden when someone else is involved, you're like, oh man, I have to do it because I don't want to show up without anything.
Exactly, it forces you. Plus, honestly, paying for it too. Like when there's money involved, when there's a deadline involved, you hold yourself more accountable to do it. Trying to learn as fast as you can, I think, is a good thing. It seems like an overwhelming thing, but like realistically, do you think you can focus on something like a language for more than like a few months? Like, there's no way that you're gonna like spend 4 years still as interested as you were when you started it. So I think that you're way more likely, like if you really want to learn Spanish, put all you got at it, just throw all you got at it for a short amount of time, because then like once you get to a certain point, I compare learning Spanish like a mountain. Like, it's harder to get up the mountain, it's harder to climb it, but once you get to the top of the mountain where you've got a feel for Spanish, you're starting to not have to translate as much anymore, the way down's so much easier and faster, and from that point on, it's just a matter of practice and reinforcing and whatnot.
Totally. Yeah, really good point. If you were to give a Spanish learner one piece of advice, just one, what would it be?
No matter what your level is, just speak, because when you have to speak, you're doing a lot of other things at the same time. You're figuring out how to translate, you're using it you're producing things, you're, all that stuff. So just speak. Like, if you don't do anything else, just figure out how to talk.
Yeah, really good advice. A lot of times students say to me, well, Nate, I want to speak, but I have no one to speak with, or I'm unconfident, or I'm nervous, or I'm embarrassed when speaking. How did you get over that?
That was the hardest part. When I met my wife, I already considered myself fluent in Spanish, and we didn't speak Spanish for months. I was so shy about it. I'm naturally like a more introverted person. When I met her, I was super intimidated to talk with people. The reason I got over that is because her family ended up moving here to the United States from Venezuela, and they didn't speak English. So I was like, either I talk in Spanish now or we're just going to stare at each other. So that's what got me out of my shell. And once I started to do that more, because up to that point, even when I met my wife, I just talked to people online. And so it was a lot easier to kind of hide behind a phone or a screen or something rather than being face to face with someone. So my biggest advice is, from the get-go, don't wait until your Spanish is at a certain level, because that's what I try to convince myself. Is like, once my Spanish gets this good, I won't be shy anymore. And that's so much BS, because whether you're a beginner or an advanced learner, you're going to be just as shy to speak in a language that's not your own language. Sometimes people get shy talking in their own language, let alone a second one. So if you can go ahead and get over that like fear of speaking from the beginning, it's going to accelerate your learning so much more.
I love that advice, because a lot of times students say the same thing to me. Well, Nate, my Spanish isn't good enough to speak with people yet, or whatever. Or I'm not confident enough. But you're never going to get to a certain level, or you're never going to become confident enough.
Confidence is earned, and the only way to get confident is by putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. Like, there's one thing you can do is just count to 3. Like, a lot of times you'll be in a conversation where people are talking in Spanish, and it's the perfect opportunity to practice, but you wait too long over analyzing what you're going to say. Whereas if you had just counted to 3 and just started talking, sometimes that can help. You can do that with anything. It's like, if you're thinking about getting up and go to the gym, or getting up to cook you a meal, and you're like contemplating it, don't let yourself wait too long to take action. Just count to 3, get up and do it, and that might help some people.
Would you say that learning Spanish is one of the best things you've ever done for yourself?
Oh yeah, my life would not be like that. We were talking about that earlier. So I can't imagine what my life would be like if I hadn't decided to learn Spanish. Because the thing about Spanish is that, obviously, it's like cliche, it opens up doors for your life or opportunities or whatever. But it's one of those things where you don't know what doors are there to even open. Like, I had no idea that Spanish would do what it's done to my life. Like, the people I've seen that have learned Spanish with me, even like the things that they're doing is crazy. A lot of people are traveling now to like places they wouldn't have traveled. One of my students went to Costa Rica and lived there for 2 months. Like, that type of thing. They come back and now they're going to like all of these different dancing classes and all these other cool things with Spanish speakers, and you never know what that could lead to either.
Yeah, I mean, now that
moving to Mexico.
That's true. I know. Yeah, I know. Trust me, my life has changed in the most insane way. I mean, I always tell students too, like, dude, learning Spanish is one of the best things I ever did for myself, if not the best thing.
I can't think of a more useful language, especially if you're an American. You're not going to give me one language that's more useful. If you like those other languages, fine. But if you're looking for like a useful, this language is worth learning, Spanish is the way to go. And don't waste time. Like, do it now, because like a decade from now, I think 1/3 of the population is going to be Spanish speaking in the United States alone. More Spanish speakers in the U.S. than any other Spanish speaking country in the world.
Right.
So,
like, actually here in Southern California, like, I'm actually a minority technically. Like, there are more Latinos, which is pretty cool.
I bet you are in LA.
Yeah. Thanks so much for chatting. Anything else you'd like to share with us, or any other final parting advice you have?
When I started learning Spanish, or before that, I thought that like after a certain point, it's just not possible to learn a second language. Like, you had to grow up doing it. You had to be in like Europe where they learn like 15 languages as a kid, or you had to grow up in a Spanish-speaking country, or you have to be in a Spanish-speaking country to learn Spanish, which is not true. I didn't step foot in a Spanish-speaking country until I was already fluent in Spanish. Just do it. Don't make excuses. That's the biggest thing. Thanks for having me, man.
You're welcome, Michael. Wise man. Muchas gracias por hablar conmigo hoy. Bueno.
Gracias por tenerme acá. Agradezco mucho eso y bueno, nos vemos en otro video, espero.
Claro que sí. Adiós.
Adiós.